I'm not sure there's a higher stakes application of AI technology than AI in the military. That's what I talk about with my guest today. Her name is Rosaria Taddeo. She's a professor of digital ethics and defense technologies at the Oxford Internet Institute at, you guessed it, the University of Oxford. We talk about a lot of things when it comes to autonomous systems or AI systems in a military context. For instance, we talk about whether we can actually control AI, given that it acts or is meant to act to some degree autonomously, and it is going to find itself in all sorts of novel situations that plausibly we can't predict or test for in advance. So, given that we might lack a certain degree of control over AI, is it ever safe to release it in that kind of context? Number one. And number two, how do we account for accountability? Whom do we hold responsible or accountable if things go sideways when autonomous AI makes a quote unquote decision in the field, in the fog of war? So that's one of the major issues that we spend quite a bit of time discussing. We also talk about this other very interesting idea about the future of military work. The future of work is one of these big topics in AI. How is AI going to affect the average worker in, say, a corporation or a startup or anything in between? How does AI affect people doing work in business? But there's this other sort of big question about how does it affect people in the military? How does it affect people on the ground? How does it affect people in procurement? How does it affect people in operations? If it's going to transform the military, what does that transformation look like? And what does it look like for the people who are in the military and the kinds of people that we need to recruit? What kind of training do they need, given that AI will transform the military? So not the future of work, or maybe it's a subset of the future of work, it's the future of military work, is just a sort of, I don't know, a phrase, an idea, an issue that I hadn't yet really thought about. And so it was great to talk about it with Rosaria. Lots of other issues, of course. Okay, so that's what this episode is about. As usual, please subscribe to the podcast. You could buy my book called Ethical Machines if you like this podcast. Actually, even if you don't like the podcast, you can still buy my book. You can also go to my Substack, readblackman.substack.com, and you can email me for comments and trenchant criticisms at em@readblackman.com. Okay, that's enough for me. Let's go talk to Rosaria. So, Rosaria, everyone knows, I think most people know about the EU AI Act. So those are regulations in the EU for AI. And what's interesting about them is that there's a carve out for the military, that none of the regulations, not even in Europe, let alone the US, is where we're going to get regulations on that front, are there regulations for AI for the military. And from what I gather, you think that we need them. And so I guess I want to know, what are the regulations that you think that we need, at least at a high level? And then I want to hear, of course, why you think we need those regulations.
So we need regulation of two types. We need regulations about the technology. So we need standards that set the level of robustness, the level of security, the type of technology that we should be using in defense. And then we need regulations about the way we use this technology. So when it is appropriate to use it, what kind of decisional processes, operational processes these technologies can be embedded to, and what kind of decisions and operations should be strictly human-led.
Do you have things in mind about, I don't know, something that things that either ought to be banned in the military, or at least certain kinds of other kinds of guardrails that you think ought to be in place?
So we need guardrails, and there are, I think, some cases where the impermissibility of some uses of AI are quite clear. But I think it's not healthy to start this debate from there. So we've been discussing
Okay.
about what is to be banned or not for about 13 years now when it comes to autonomous weapon systems, for example.
Yeah.
Framing the debate in that way has led to nothing but a huge normative gap. We've polarized ourselves in those who are pro and those who are against, in favor or
Yeah.
against. Exactly. We haven't built a common ground where people who think in different ways can meet and discuss. In the meanwhile, technology has evolved, and also the use of this technology has evolved in defense.
Yeah.
Autonomous weapon systems are not a taboo anymore. The reported use was in 2021 in Libya, but that was a single case. If you look at Ukraine war, which is a watershed moment into this digitalization process of defense, both sides have used autonomous weapon systems, potentially fully autonomous weapon systems, within a huge normative gap. So I think, yes, there are cases that we definitely should set out of the remit of what is, or the scope of what is legitimate or acceptable. But why don't we start from the thing that we want to have? We want to use AI and trying to regulate those, try to understand, even in those, what are the boundaries, what is the best choice, or the better choice. So I will spin it, I'm afraid. It's not a rhetorical move, it's a real need to change the way we debate these topics.
Okay, so I think there's two threads I want to pick up on. One is, okay, you don't want to talk about banning stuff. You want to talk about some other way of approaching the issue. So I don't yet have a grip on that. And sorry, and before we get into that, though, you also mentioned, you made this distinction between semi-autonomous and autonomous weaponry, or fully autonomous. So could you, maybe before we go into the sort of how we should talk about it, can you say a little bit about that distinction and what's been used so far, let's say in Ukraine on the semi-autonomous front, and where full autonomy is used, has been used, might be used, et cetera?
Yeah, so the level of autonomy is about, suppose we're talking about autonomous weapon systems, which is just one of the uses of AI in defense. Now, a weapon has a cycle, which is about identify a target, selecting the target, engage the target. Now, it depends in how many of these steps are delegated to a machine and how many of these steps are part of the human agency. That sets the threshold or the difference between a semi-autonomous and a fully autonomous weapon system.
Got it.
Fully autonomous weapon systems are systems in where all the steps they lead to the targeting, delegated to a machine. Now, point of view, going back to the debate about what is permissible and not, from an ethical point of view, the idea of delegating all the steps and so the overall decisions to take a life, because we're talking about lethal machines, and an artificial intelligence system is immoral. And I agree, it's immoral for two reasons. It diminishes the dignity of the target. There are many, we can articulate on this, but even if the target is a combatant, the machine might take the decision in a way that is completely immoral. And so this is one reason why those machines should not be used. They are not controllable 100%. We have an issue, which is the predictability of AI systems. So we cannot deploy them being sure 100% that they will do what they are meant to do. And then we have still the issue of the responsibility gap. No, we cannot attribute, we don't know yet how to attribute moral responsibilities to humans for the actions that these machines do. And in war, without attributing moral responsibility, is nothing but a great way of violating the morality of war. There is a sense of morality in war, and attributing moral responsibility is crucial to it, because it's the bare minimum we can do to respect our opponents. There is a wonderful sentence in the documents of the Nuremberg trials. They say we need to identify the individual responsible for the action that are done during the war, because it's the only way in which we can maintain the morality of war. We cannot just blame the Nazi party, the Nazi government. We need to find the individuals, because crimes in war are committed also by individuals. So for these reasons, I think that fully autonomous lethal weapon systems should not be allowed. But I also think that stressing this point now is useless and is dangerous, because these machines have been used to some extent. And there is an area where it's possible to conceive permissibility. We need to work on that. Coming to your question, to what types of machines have been used from both sides, there are plenty of cases. The interesting thing I would note is that one of the way we keep records of the legality of what happens on the battlefield is by keeping observers there. The observers these days can be everybody with a mobile phone. Or when it comes to lethal autonomous weapon systems, it's very hard, almost impossible, actually impossible, for an observer to tell this is a fully autonomous or semi-autonomous weapon systems. And so this is one of the key questions we need to start to focus on. How do we make these systems identifiable, whether we can? Because otherwise we might as well set a ban and then everybody might be able to circumvent it.
Okay, there's 1,000 threads that you just offered that we could go down. I'm not sure which path I want to go down the most. I want to go down a lot of them. One thing that I want to call out, I suppose, off the top is, as you said, we can't fully control the AI. There's a fairly obvious reply to that, which is not saying it's compelling, but I want to just hear your response, which is you can't fully control soldiers either. You can't really control commanders of soldiers either. War crimes happen all the time. It's by people that you can't fully control. It's contrary to military policy, blah, 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 blah. But all sorts of things go completely ethically sideways. And so the bar, why should we think that the bar for something like sufficiently safe to deploy is complete control when it ought to be, arguably anyway, as safer than the alternative,
So there are
which would be imperfect humans.
Yeah, it's a great question. So two questions. One is that it is true that you cannot control a soldier, a human being. It's also true that you can hold those people responsible for what they do. So martial courts and that sort of thing. So that doesn't happen with machines. A machine is not responsible for what it does. But the point, I think, and this is the moral point, the other point is also very interesting. I'm not saying that we should keep machines at the highest standards that we do for humans. The point at the moment, we have no standards. There is a question, which is what standard do we want to have for a machine in warfare, knowing that this machine has a predictability problem. So there is a percentage that varies with the model you use, the way it's been trained, the way it's used. What is the standard that we want to use? And I refer to standard in technical terms. At the moment, we don't have the standard. So this is the question.
So I think I understand that point. So let me give a line of thought and tell me what you think. So suppose I say, look, at the end of the day, autonomous weapons, semi-autonomous weapons, they're a tool. They're a tool that is built in certain way by people, tested in certain ways by people, monitored in certain ways by people, greenlit for deployment or use in particular contexts by people. And even if it's, as you said, fully autonomous, still someone has to say, yes, let's give this weapon the ability to do each one of those things throughout that life cycle that you articulated earlier. Identify the target, engage the target, pull the trigger, all the things. So why not say, look, we've got rules of warfare. We've got people who are making decisions about how to use these tools. We don't need to wheel in anything new around standards for AI or regulations around AI. The existing ones do just fine. And the questions will be, in various cases, did the person in deploying and making the decision to use this AI tool, were they ethically or morally negligent? Was the decision made without sufficient information? Is it roughly analogous to saying, I told the soldiers to charge the hill even though I had no clue whatsoever who was behind the hill and what weapons they had, blah, blah, blah. There's recklessness and negligence in normal military decision-making. So why not just let it fall under those other already existing categories and ways of thinking about, what constitutes moral negligence, let alone moral abominations?
It would be like trying to to eat a soup with a fork.
Okay, I love the metaphor. I just don't get it yet.
Let me unpack it. No, so this is what the instinctive reaction to the point. It's a good point. It's a point that we need to discuss.
It's not a good point if it's like eating soup with a fork.
No, but it's a good point to bring it up because this is what you have to discuss. So let's unpack it a little bit. So we take for example, due diligence. And every time you put a new product on the market, you have to do some due diligence for possible harm and safety issues that thing might cause.
Some kind of risk assessment.
Yes. Yeah. Usually, the risk space is very much delineated. And if you do enough due diligence, you're able to understand and identify all feasible risks. So not a black swan, the known and no unknowns you can set up. And so you can be at fault if you don't run your due diligence properly, because you could have identified some risks in that sense. When it comes to AI, we have a different object in our hands. We don't have, first of all, an object anymore. We have an agent. And we have an agent that is able to interact autonomously with the environment and learn from these interactions. So it means that not only depending on the way the agent has been designed and developed, but also depending on the environment in which it's deployed, the agent might pick up things we never foresaw. The hallucination we all experience with LLMs. There was a few years ago, this is a bot produced by Microsoft on Twitter. You remember? Took him less than a day. Took it less than a day to become Nazi, misogynist.
Right, before LLMs. Yep.
Yeah, and that was not because Tai or Microsoft are Nazi or misogynist. It's because the thing learned something from the environment and just now in defense. Imagine like a robot who goes into the fog of war. It goes in a battle. Many things are happening. Anything can be learned and picked up. That it's not reasonable to think that a designer or developer could have or should have, from a legal and ethical point of view, more importantly, from what we're discussing here today, a clear cut between action and intentionality. Don't have intentionality, you cannot ascribe moral responsibility in a fair and justified way. Legally, you can say from now on the general is responsible, or from now on, but from a moral point of view, you cannot do that. because the intentionality has been not completely, but severely detached from the effort of your machine. And this is problematic per se. It is even more problematic in not just defense, warfare, because international humanitarian laws, just war theory, they regulate every single aspect of strategic, decisional, and operational processes of waging a war. Mm-hmm. When you throw in something which is super powerful, but that you don't control to the level that these regulations require you to control, then you are in a very problematic context. Because suppose that the machine decides that to take that target, the most effective way is to bomb the school near it. This is a not even remotely realistic example, but just to make the case. Removed every human from the loop so that they can meaningfully intervene and stop it. You couldn't even foresee it before. Who's responsible for the 5 children, the 10 children, whoever is in the school who should have not been killed because that's illegal? So this is the point. The point is that we've taken away one element from moral decision making, which is intentionality, and it's very hard to understand from this how to attribute more responsibilities for AI and also to operationalize control of AI because of this.
I'm going to put your response slightly differently, and you tell me if it's a misrepresentation. I think, at least this is where I thought you were heading, but then it went slightly differently towards the end. I thought what you were going to say is something like, in principle, yes. In principle, if people can do their due diligence on a tool and have reasonable assurances that it will act in ways that are more or less predictable, then yes, that's totally fine. And so I think you accept that principle. The response is that for AI in particular, it's simply not possible, at least given today's tools and monitoring capabilities, it's simply not possible to do the level of due diligence that would be required. Because the level of due diligence that would be required would be to run it through testing scenarios for all the possible scenarios it might meet in the fog of war, which is literally impossible, at least as a... You're right. Yeah. And so because of that, it's not that you're saying... I think you can concede. No, look, yes, AI is a tool. You can call it an agent if you want. I'm not sure what you get out of that. Why not just say, I concede it's a tool, and if you can use it responsibly, and we could treat it just like every other tool. And here's how we treat every other tool. We don't allow you to use it unless you can do sufficient testing that would provide you with reasonable expectations about how it would perform. And AI doesn't meet that threshold. And so that's what the problem is.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't think that it's with respect to the threshold. I would say that we don't know yet when it meets it and when it doesn't meet it, because we have fixing those thresholds. But it's correct. Adding is that I think this approach is more constructive than the previous one that we're discussing, the principled approach to it, because it allows to create a space where people who have different views can just start talking about risk assessment, basically, and risk thresholds. Yeah. And still defining the limit cases, but also trying to be constructive on all the stuff that is in the middle.
You said earlier that you think that AI is reshaping the landscape, the military landscape. Can you say more about that? Does that boil down to that it's a suite of tools that acts in unpredictable ways, or are there what other kinds of impacts are AI having on the military landscape such that we really need to think carefully about what regulation might look like?
For one thing, we have a capability that we don't predict and we all use. Was a thing, that was it. No, I think that we discuss autonomous weapon systems, and this is a topic that is central to this debate. But actually, particularly with the war in Ukraine, we have understood that AI has a potential to underpin all sets of operations in defense, from intelligence to situational awareness to cyber to kinetic. And it's not just a way of making things happen faster. It's not just that. It's reshaping many processes in the defense. For example, all of a sudden, data that we all produce, whether on social media, whether from intelligence, they're all relevant for decision making in military context. So they shift, for example, in the context of a war, the level of surveillance and privacy that we all suffer and enjoy. Ukrainian being asked to submit pictures of tanks, Russian tanks in their city for the open source intelligence analysis. That all makes all stuff that was pretty much civilian until a few years ago, something that all of a sudden becomes dual use of many industries in our society is going to become much more pressing. The moment in which the same cloud provider offers its services to defense forces engaged in war and a school and a hospital, that becomes harder to manage. And that's all because of AI, because the digitalization of defense and AI, but everything is conducing here. If you think about the way decisions are made in terms of strategy and tactics, that also AI has an impact, because you start officers who make decisions supported by these machines. It becomes an hybrid team. So issues of creativity in design of strategies start to emerge, but also issues of autonomy. How much should a soldier and officer trust the machine, and how much they should? These are questions that, for those of us who have worked in this area, are not new. Doctors and healthcare systems were addressing these questions 10 years ago, but they're coming to become very relevant to defense, down to the way in which we kill, the way in which we use force in war. So I'm not a fan of the distinction whether it's a revolution of military affair or a military revolution. I think that's too scholar a distinction. But I think it's changing a lot the dynamic of defense. And that's why I like to talk about AI in defense and not in warfare, because warfare is really a waging battlefield, is the tip of it. Think about procurement. These days, we have several issues with procurement of AI capabilities in defense. For one thing, companies who procure AI to defense, they mostly are major companies, and they operate a lock-in. So all of a sudden, you are locked in with a company for 10, 20 years, and you cannot diversify your sources, which is problematic, because perhaps you're sourcing AI from a country which is a friend now, but might be a friend in 5 years. The other question is, for example, AI needs data. And in Europe or Western world, we haven't seen a war with fresh data in many years. Ukraine is the first one. And it's not a case that many AI companies or software companies have established labs there supporting inside, but they all this data. Now, these are sensitive data, very sensitive, very costly data, because to engage in a war, a state spends a lot of money. Who's controlling this data? Flowing back to Europe, US, in the hands of US and European companies, or are they in the hands of the Ukrainian government? So it's the whole process, whether it's not just whether it's battlefield, but whether it's also organization, whether it's procurement, that is being reshaped.
Give me two things. I want two things.
The two things are not minor, but I think less conceptual, but very important. We don't talk about defense in our societies, at least in my experience in Europe. We all talk about healthcare. We all talk about finance, because sooner or later you need to ask for a mortgage. We need to talk about defense, because I'm afraid we're going to need defense pretty soon, and also because defense is one of the benchmarks of democracies. So this debate about AI in defense is a good occasion, I think, to do that. And the other thing is that defense is adopting AI later than other sectors. So we come to this topic with a bit of an AI ethics fatigue, as you were. No? We talked about bias and relentlessly about lack of transparency and black boxes. So now it's okay, what's new? What's more? Why should I focus on this when I've done this already for these other sectors? The trade-offs are different. The problems are the same, but the trade-offs, the solutions are different. And we need to focus on those.
Okay, so there's so much I want to say now. So one thing I want to mention is that I think you might be suffering from what academics suffer from, which is, we already talked about that thing. Everyone knows that thing already. So now we can move on to the next thing. And the reason why it's academics suffer from it is because academics are like, and I speak as a former one, I was a professor for 10 years. You're like, yeah, I wrote the paper. I did the thing. We're done now. Now I'm on to the next thing. I'm on to the next research project. But no one has caught up. And even though I hear you totally when you're like, we did this already, it's the same thing. For some people, they're still hearing about bias in AI. Heads of corporations are still hearing about bias in AI. Yes, it's like you said it on Alpha Centauri and it's still working its way over to Earth. So that's just one side comment. Anyway, but I really like the way that you framed everything else. One highlight is a lot of the conversation of AI ethics in the military is about warfare and autonomous weaponry and when is it okay to greenlight and what's safe. But that's the wrong, or at least that's too narrow an aperture. We need to think wider. The other thing that I think you did nicely is to, at least if I think about the corporate world, when people talk about AI and how it's shaping work, people talk about AI and the future of work. This is a big, whatever phrase that gets tossed around, the future of work. And what does it look like for knowledge workers and these people and across all industries, whether it's finance or healthcare? And so we think about how is AI going to transform all workers in corporations, small businesses, blah, blah, blah. And then we can go and ask the sort of ethical questions that we typically ask, and how do we do that in a responsible, ethical, blah, blah, blah way. And I take it your point is there's future of defense as another big phrase. And if you think about future of defense, now you're thinking about not how does it transform the workers in healthcare, finance, blah, 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 but how do we think about soldiers and other military personnel in military, and how is their world being transformed? And then how do we transform it in an ethical and responsible, et cetera, way? Is that a fair sort of comparison, you think?
No, I think it's very fair, very correct, more than fair. It is what it is, exactly what it is. We're transforming defense with AI in a radical way, and that will change.
Yeah.
It's not just the soldiers, it's not just the military, it's also the decision maker, it's also the politician, because depending on the capabilities you have, and especially in this moment where the potential of AI is very much inflated, that might change the way in which political decisions are made. So to me, it's even a wider input.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, that sounds right. Let me ask you this. I guess I want to know, what's the highest priority? We want to probably prioritize the highest risk stuff. Talking about autonomous weaponry, I can't tell. It seems like it's a high priority precisely because it's going on in places like Ukraine. It's also a sexy problem in a way, right? Like I'm wondering if there are other, given that the future of defense, and this is a giantly broad thing, lots of issues all across, who knows how many points in which there's going to be AI integrated into defense across the board. Are there places that we should be looking to first to say, holy shit, we really need standards, or we really need regulations, or we really need a code of conduct? Where should we be looking first to get things done?
I think that one of the key sources of all the problems we've been discussing so far is the predictability issue, which is entangled with other aspects. So the predictability issue or problem is this thing, we could say it easily, is the fact that you cannot predict the outcome of an AI system, a system that learns online, so new AI, first wave AI, with 100%. So we have limited control of it. Now, the predictability problem is, let's say, compounded by other aspects. So one is the limited robustness of AI. So AI is a technology that is shifted very easily with minimum input. You change one pixel in the images you feed to an image system, and it shifts. It gets confused between turtles and rifle. That is a question we can tackle. What are the standards for robustness of AI systems that are going to be used for kinetic purposes, so systems, for cyber, or for intelligence? That's one issue that would allow us to start eroding the big problem that we have in front of us. The other question is less technical, is more, let's say, governance related. We need to understand a way in which we can attribute more responsibility for the actions of the system in an appropriate and fair and justified way. I say this despite I've written a paper on it. Forget about my paper, but we need to have a solution for that. Wars will be fought anyway, whether we do that or not. But having that, let's say, approach, being able to ascribe more responsibility will make the difference between a society that goes to war with a sense of morality and an authoritarian, a terrorist, a crime organization that does that. So we need to do that for ourselves. I think I will start from these two things, because the robustness will allow us to solve many of the ethical/technical issues, and the moral responsibility will allow us to get into this new type of war with a better sense of what we are, and might also help us have a better way of implementing control over this technology further down the line.
So I get that. So the first thing is, let's nail down what the heck we mean by predictable and robust, such that it's sufficiently safe to deploy. That's also going to have to get carved up by context, right? So we might need it to be this level of robust for this context and that level of robust for that other context, right? And then I'm not sure, is the second thing just what does overall governance of the systems look like throughout defense? Is that the...
It's a concept, is where philosophy needs to hit the ground. It's a conceptual solution that we need to rationalize in our society. Perhaps it's the first time in many years, many centuries, that we need, as philosophers, to get to work into society. We need to find a solution. We need to be able to tell our soldier, soldiers, this is what you're responsible for, and this is what you're not responsible for. We need to be able to tell on the other side, this happened because of a mistake, and this person is the one to be blamed, and we're going to make sure that they are blamed. It's something quite huge that doesn't, I don't know, perhaps there's a philosophical sense that allows us to perceive it. It's not going to make any difference operationally, but it's going to make a lot of difference culturally and socially and morally.
Is it something like a focus on accountability? How do we distribute accountability, or how do we think about accountability, or who's responsible, including morally responsible?
Exactly. It's accountability, but the word moral here is crucial, because when you take it to the legal, let's say, aspect of it, you can decide that from now on X is morally responsible, but if no sense of what it's doing, it does not take them moral responsibility as a connotation of her or his or their moral character, then moral responsibility means nothing. It becomes like a moral responsibility washing, so to speak. So we need to find a way for that to be meaningful. It's a crucial part.
So I suppose we started this with talking about the need for regulation, but it seems to me that we're not in a place yet where we could pass or articulate what a good regulation looks like. Because if what we have to focus on is what does robustness actually amount to in various defense contexts, and what counts as sufficiently robust for each of those contexts, that's one. The second thing is, how do we think about accountability or responsibility, moral responsibility? And then how do we craft things that would transmit that information, communicate that information to soldiers, let's say via a code of conduct or something along those lines? All that stuff has to be developed. It takes real work. And it seems to me like we have to hold off on regulations until we figure that stuff out. Otherwise, don't we just pass regulations that don't speak to the real solutions?
So the good news is that we don't need to start from scratch. There is international humanitarian and just war theory. They are completely valid when it comes to AI. It's a matter of understanding how they apply. So we don't need to start from, oh my God, what is right and what is wrong. We need to start on when it's right and when it's wrong. So a lot of work still. Also because it has to be, I doubt there will be a global governance of AI in defense, but there has to be, the UK has its own regulation, the US have their own regulation. That's wrong on. Even in terms of supporting interoperability, you have some kind of shared rules. So it's not that much. It's a lot of work, but it's not something that will take 100 years, hopefully, to be done. The objection I usually have...
Philosophy will debate it for 100 years. Plus,
oh, yes, we want to make a living somehow.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But hopefully someone else will be able to carry on the weight and the torch over the finishing line. We are in this situation where we cannot say anymore we pause on the use of AI in defense, because every major actor thinks it's a key capability, and so they all have. I cannot stop that process anymore. But I think because of that, at least for liberal democracies, we're not in the position anymore saying we don't regulate yet because we don't know what we're doing. We got ourselves into this situation, so we should be really blamed for having let things go for the past 15 years the way they've gone. But now we have to work as hard as possible to get out of this situation. Because...
Let me ask you one last thing. And I think this is I'll just ask the question. I'm trying to think about how much I should think about or be focused on, especially in an antagonistic relationship between, say, two countries, how much I have to think about, or what my moral remit is, given how they're behaving. It's adversarial. We signed up for a certain, we don't use this if it's not reaches this level of robustness. They didn't sign up for that, though. And so they're just throwing all sorts of crazy shit at us. Does that impact how I should think about my own commitment to robustness? Does the level of robustness, as an example, or the level of responsibility or something like that, does that vary in a defense context or military context or a warfare context? Does that vary based on how my opposition is using these tools? Let's say they're using it without strict controls around robustness and accountability.
Yeah, that's the question that I can never escape. Everybody asks this question. And that's a good question. It's a good question because I think it's the first question that people have when you think about AI in defense. There are many things to mention about that. The first thing is that AI is not super secure as a technology. It's not super robust and it's not super stable. So I wouldn't assume that less regulations and less standard make a better product. The guy who's using AI with less regulation is using the best capability. But putting this aside, I think there is a moral argument. example you made is a realist example, no? So the realist goes to war thinking about whatever it takes, we'll do it. But
Yeah.
the fallacy in the realistic approach is that it opens the way to a race to the bottom, right? So
Oh yeah.
it lets
It's a bad situation for sure. Yeah.
It lets the opponent set the moral standard for
the moral
for
floor. Yeah.
And that's really bad. We are liberal democracies. And I think that the way in which we wage war, taking this from Clausewitz, but it's a good benchmark of how serious we are about the values and the rights that stand as a grounding element of our society. So if to forego those values and rights the moment in which we enter war, I think it's A, we're defeating ourselves. B, there's no point in having a war anymore because we basically like the other guy who we're trying to fence off. So why don't we join sides? You can terrorists to wage the terrorists, because if the methods are the same, there's no point anymore. So I think at some point, and it's very rarely that we get, I think, realistically to those scenarios, but if we get there, it becomes a virtue choice. It becomes understanding whether you want to be the better or the worse person, so to speak, in the room. It's an important discussion to have, but it's also a discussion keeping in mind that regulations are not just there to bound actions. Regulations are also there to support actions in terms of making more safe, favoring interoperability. So, for example, making alliances more strong, and so on and so forth. So it's not just the forbidding element; it is also an enabling element. But I will personally I've been in the UK for too long, I would say disappointed, but there must be some stronger word to convey the feeling.
Yeah.
If 70, 80 years of debate on liberal democracies, human rights, they go out of the window the moment the opposite guy, the opponent have something stronger, and we need to forget about who we are to win them. So that's the answer, I'm afraid. So this is a bit realistic, but yeah.
That's a good ending on an episode on ethics and warfare. This has been really fascinating, and once you figure out what accountability and predictability robustness looks like, you'll have to come back and tell us. Happy
to. At that point, I would be very rich because I would have the key to the new use of AI.
That's right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your patience before.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening, and now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So, first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design the podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasilenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.